Buenas tardes. Bueno,
Good afternoon.
en primer
Well,
lugar,
first of all,
muchas
thank you
gracias
very much to everyone
a
who is
todos los que
here.
están presentes, porque
Professor
Profesor Ariazu,
Ariazu. That's it,
qué
I've
honor.
already won.
Listo, yo ya gané.
Thank
Gracias,
you,
profesor.
Professor. First of all,
No, en primer lugar quiero darle las gracias a cada
I
uno
want
de
to
los que
thank
están
each and
aquí
every one of you who is
por
here for
contribuir
contributing to
con
this
esta
enormous work that the
enorme
foundation is carrying out
labor
and
que
to the
lleva a
enormous,
cabo la fundación y en el laburo enorme, gigante
gigantic
que
work that
hace
my
mi
dear
querido
friend
amigo
Dario
Darío
Epstein
Epstein
is
para
doing to
llevar
carry this
adelante
out.
esto. Así es que felicitaciones, Darío, y gracias a todos.
And
Porque es
thank
para
you
una
all,
obra de
because
bien.
it is a good work, charity in the good sense, because it
Caridad
is
en el buen sentido,
voluntary
porque es
and not by
voluntaria
force.
y no por la fuerza. Bien. Básicamente, lo que
Basically, what I am going to try
voy
to
a tratar
explain is the
de
inheritance
explicar
that we received, what we did, where
es
we are going
la
and where
herencia
we
que
are going to go,
recibimos,
despite
lo
politics.
que hicimos, hacia dónde vamos y vamos a
Yes,
ir
and
a
I am going
pesar
to
de
leave
la
some
política.
preliminary ideas on the discussion
¿Sí?
of convergence, that is,
Voy a
how
dejar
Argentina
algunas
can
ideas
become a developed
preliminares
country.
sobre la discusión de la convergencia, es decir, cómo Argentina puede
Basically,
convertirse en un
we
país
have
desarrollado.
inherited a disaster and we do not complain about that
Básicamente,
because that a
nosotros hemos
libertarian
heredado
liberal
un
becomes the
desastre
first president in the history of
y nosotros
humanity
no nos
could not
quejamos
happen
de
under
eso
normal
porque,
conditions.
digamos, que un liberal libertario llegue a
So
ser el
we were
primer
clear
presidente de la
that,
historia de
if
la
we got
humanidad,
there,
digamos,
it would be in a
podría ser
very
en condiciones
complicated
normales. Así
situation.
es que, con lo cual teníamos claro que si llegábamos iba a ser en una situación muy
At the same
complicada.
time, we were also
Al mismo
clear, and we
tiempo,
had maintained this during the campaign,
también
that
teníamos claro, y eso lo habíamos sostenido sobre la campaña,
if the
que
crisis
si
broke out, it would be easier to
estallaba la
resolve
crisis, eso
because
era
the
más fácil
adjustment would be
resolver porque
imposed by reality
teníamos una
itself on
imponer la propia
politics.
realidad a la política, y que el caso complicado era si no
And that the
estallaba, pero que también
complicated
estábamos
case was if
preparados
it did
para
not break
resolver el
out,
caso
but
de
that we
que
were
si no
also
estallaba,
prepared to resolve the case in
y
which it did not
efectivamente fue
break
lo que nos
out.
tocó hacer, y afortunadamente empezamos a trabajar
Indeed, that was what we had to do and,
en resolver los
fortunately,
problemas de la
we began
Argentina
to work
desde
on
el primer
solving
día.
Argentina's problems
Y
from day
eso,
one.
digamos, ha evitado el desastre.
And that has
Concretamente,
avoided
nosotros hemos
disaster.
recibido
Specifically,
herencia,
we have
para
inherited,
ponerlo
to
en
put it
fácil,
simply, 17 points of twin deficit in terms of GDP,
más o menos para tener un orden de magnitudes. 4 es
more or less to have an order of magnitude. 4 is a
luz
yellow light.
amarilla, 8 es rojo camino a la piña, imagínense
8 is
17.
red on the way to the
De
pineapple,
esos
imagine
17, digamos,
17.
15 eran explicados por el
Of those
déficit fiscal.
17,
El
15 were
déficit
explained
fiscal,
by the
digamos, venían
fiscal
5 del
deficit,
Tesoro
and the
y
fiscal
10 del Banco
deficit came
Central.
5 from the Treasury and 10 from
Pero
the central
además,
bank.
como si eso fuera poco, dentro de lo que era el
But,
déficit cuasi
in
fiscal,
addition,
10
as if
puntos del
that were not
PBI,
enough, within the fiscal deficit, those
teníamos
10
la
points of
relación pasivos
GDP had the
remunerados
highest
en
relationship of
términos de pasivo
remunerated
monetario más alto de la
liabilities, in
historia.
terms of monetary
Estábamos
base,
aún
in
por encima de
history.
niveles a los que se habían
We were still above the
percibido
levels that had been
el
perceived in
año
1989,
previo
prior to
de la posible
Alfonsin's
recesión.
hyperinflation.
Pero con un agravante adicional,
But with an additional
y es que
aggravating
en
factor,
un
and that is
gesto de
that, in a gesture of
responsabilidad, cariño y
responsibility,
patriotismo del gobierno anterior, los había pasado todos a
affection
un
and
día.
patriotism, the
Con lo
previous
cual,
government had passed everything on to one day.
y la verdadera
And the
apuesta
real bet of
de
our predecessors was
nuestros
that we would come
predecesores
in,
era que nosotros entráramos, abriéramos
open
todo
everything happily,
alegremente
from the
desde el
moment
momento
zero,
cero,
and, in truth,
y
they understood that we are libertarians.
digamos, es verdad, digamos, entendieron
Now,
que
what they
somos
believed was that we
libertarios.
ate
Ahora,
glass.
lo que ellos creían era que comíamos vidrio.
No, we do not
No,
eat
vidrio
glass.
no comemos. Entonces, en
So,
ese
in that
sentido, la
sense,
apuesta que ellos tenían era que
their bet was
eso
that this would
gatillara
trigger a
una
huge
gran
run,
corrida, que
that the
se
amount of money
cuadruplicara
would
la cantidad
quadruple
de
in a
dinero
few days.
en muy pocos días, que eso detonara
That
una
this would trigger
hiperinflación,
hyperinflation
y
and,
en el
in the
medio de
middle of
toda
all
esa
this mega
mega
crisis,
ellos
they would
volver
return to
al poder,
power in
propiamente
January,
en
in a
enero, en un
context where
contexto
they were
donde
also going to be
además se iban
busy
a ocupar de
generating
generar
looting.
saqueos,
Attacks on
ataques a
supermarkets
supermercados,
and all the
y ahora la
stories we
historia que ya
already know.
conocemos.
And this in a context where, in addition, we were starting from a monetary imbalance worse than the one we had before the Rodrigazo and with social indicators worse than those we had in 2001. In other words, a perfect combo whereby the caste made us pay for all the adjustment and they would then come as saviors and do the great Kirchner. Grab everything in the fifth basement and show it as a wonderful work, which was nothing more or less than a rebound and helped by an international context rarely seen. But that was not the only problem we had, because we also had other problems such as the Sierra debt, which was $50 billion. We had the problem of trapped dividends. So, in addition, we had a problem that was not only the problems we had with the flows, we had phenomenal stock problems. And the way in which you solve the stock problems, if you do not do it correctly and they are transformed into flows, automatically that jump can generate very complicated consequences in the macroeconomic dynamics. Especially if the dollar is an advance indicator of what can happen in terms of prices. Consequently, the problem you are going to get into there is much bigger still. Why? Because a jump that could be temporary causes the demand for money to fall, and that can become unstable and become permanent in a crisis. The other problem we had was that we received an internal debt, about to mature, for the equivalent of $90 billion. We had external debt due for $25 billion. But although most of it was with multilateral organizations, we had the problem that Argentina had fallen through with the International Monetary Fund. It was very interesting because, when they talked and said that we had a program that was not consistent and a lot of things they said, it was interesting because, in general, when you have a characteristic like that the program is down, you have to be discussing it for at least 3 months, and, especially, if there is a new administration. And the interesting thing is that we resolved it in a weekend. It means that we had not done things that badly. At the same time, we had a problem with international reserves. The net international reserves that we inherited were around $11.5 billion in the red, with a gap of 200%. Also, if you look at how economic activity was going, economic activity, during the first part of the year, was falling and then it picked up, based on how the previous government began to cut back on the economy, giving it to public spending and financing it with monetary emission. To give you an idea, throughout the entire period of the government, 28 points of GDP were issued to finance the treasury. But of those 28, 13 took place in the election year. In other words, they were leaving a huge bomb and it was better for it to explode on someone else and come back. But we did not give them that pleasure. The flip side of this was how the inflation issue was going. The first week, in December, it was going at a rate of 1% per day, which is something like 3,700% per year. In the second week it accelerated and went to levels of 7,500% per year. We had done the calculations, in terms of monetary surpluses and so on. And we calculated that, if we did not take urgent measures, inflation could reach levels of 15,000% per year. This, which seemed like an exaggeration, is interesting to see that when you look at the month of December, wholesale inflation, which usually precedes retail inflation, was 54% per month. 54% monthly means 17,000% annually. Actually, That could have happened if we had started to validate the currency, which, obviously, we did not do, and wholesale inflation in April was 3.4%. That, annualized, gives us almost 50%. Yes, I understand that 50% is a horror, but we came from 17,000. And to have an idea of the magnitude of what was done, then based on that, we designed a stabilization plan, a stabilization program. Basically, there are different ways of doing it. Sometimes I have a hard time understanding if things are done wrong, intentionally, or if they are done wrong because they are stupid. That is to say, when you design an economic program, whatever it may be, you cannot demand that the person who will carry it out be and think like you. You have to put yourself in the shoes of the person who is doing it. So, and it would seem ridiculous to me, if we are within a liberal libertarian program, to start thinking in terms of what I am going to do sectorally. What I am going to do with this. How I am going to control prices, how I am going to manage the dynamics of relative prices. I am a liberal libertarian, I believe in freedom, so. Sometimes it is like they ask for things that are not within the DNA of what one is going to do, because it is not the only way to do things. In our conception, an economic program has three central elements. What can I contribute from the macro, which is the fiscal adjustment? Yes, that is, a fiscal policy. A monetary policy that basically consists of cleaning up the balance sheet of the central bank, and an exchange policy to make sense of the disaster we had in the external sector. Then, that of looking at, fiddling with, dawning on relative prices and that a price-wage agreement must be made is not in my conception. This thing about picking winners is not in my conception, and don't even think of asking me for it because you won't get it. I am a liberal libertarian. In that context, we had to attack the fiscal deficit, and the first thing we did was clearly attack the fiscal deficit, and we attacked it from two sides. Obviously, with a fiscal adjustment in the Treasury and attacking the balance sheet of the central bank. In fact, we had said it in the campaign itself. We talked about chainsaw, and boy was there a chainsaw. Now it happens that some people said that it was not possible to adjust more than 1 point of GDP. So, of course, when the adjustment phase started and it ended up being the equivalent of 7, then we began to question the quality of the adjustment. First point, out of 123 years, we had 113 deficits. So it was not so easy to make the adjustment. Second point, have you seen what the fiscal degenerates are like in action last night? So look at what this fight is like. But unlike others, with half-point adjustments to GDP, and they ended up blowing up. We made the adjustment of 7 and we are standing here. And we are going to continue to fight. And every time the degenerate prosecutors, politicians, want to go and break the fiscal balance, I'll tell them now, I said it before, I'll say it now, and I'll repeat it until I'm tired. I'm going to veto everything, I don't give a damn. So, when we were moving forward with this adjustment, the serial blunderers began to question the quality of the adjustment. And then they said, a lot of blenders and scissors. Well, Ecuador and scissors. 90% of the adjustment is a chainsaw and only 10% of the adjustment, only if you look at the treasury, corresponds to the blender. So, among the things we did, which were also impossible until we did them, one of the things we did was that we said, I don't know if you remember, it's my most famous phrase internationally. I would like you to remember another one, but you remember this one, which is one that says, get out. And today they are campaigning, all over the world, with the get out. Well, the outside meant cutting the number of ministries in half and reducing the entire structure of the state in half. And that was not free because, obviously, we fired people. In terms of contracts, we are going to end up firing 75,000 people. We already have 25,000. So, not only was the number of ministries cut in half, we eliminated discretionary transfers to the provinces. We eliminated, completely, public works. We eliminated contracts. Not only that, but one of the things we knew was that the program was going to generate social tension and that it was also going to generate a drop in activity. When you make an adjustment, what it does is increase savings. So, if that increase in savings is not matched by investment, your employment activity and real wages are going to fall. So, while we were making the adjustment and we had announced that there was going to be a contraction of activity, which is what happened during the first quarter of the year. What do we say if we decide to make a strong social containment policy? So, we doubled the AUH, we doubled the food card, we increased school attendance. We multiplied almost 5 times the assistance for the children's school supplies, and we also gave financing to the middle class who go to private schools so that the children would not miss going to school, because in addition to the serious situation that the family is experiencing, if on top of that they lose school and the children have to start changing schools and have to change classmates and all that generates a very big trauma. For that reason, we also attacked that. But we did not only do that, and we are seeing an enormous task, which was done by Minister Petovelo, who has been so torpedoed in these last few days. That is to say, let's see. We have just made a tremendous adjustment and we only have complaints, on the social level, from the poverty managers. That is to say, we have grown tired of hearing, in conferences, that we had to end the work of the intermediaries, that we had to end the corruption in social programs, that we had to get out of welfare so that those who had the misfortune of falling into these unfortunate situations could get ahead with dignity. We are doing it now. What did they think was free? It is obvious that all the crooks who lost the jobs were going to get angry, which is what they are seeing, and they are operating on her and, therefore, the government from all sides. Look at the wonderful thing that Minister Petovelo did, together with Minister Bullrich, whom I thank for being here. And at that moment, the Minister of Infrastructure, Guillermo Ferraro, one of the things that Petovelo discovers and realizes is that, although the people who received the plans have cards, then one believes that the problem there had ended. So, well, anyway. They received cards, of course. But they had to go and verify that they were working, and who did that? The poverty managers, and that was where they paid the right of pernada. That is to go. That was where they lost half of the plan, and with that they also extorted people to go to the marches. That is, we gave them money so that people could have social support. The poverty managers took it and enslaved people and used them to march against those who work, Dantesque. So, there, at that moment, what did Minister Petovelo discover? At that moment, they criticized her a lot. He says, since we knew that the first quarter was going to be very hard. During the first quarter, what we said was that they had to stop giving out proof of work. Of course, why is that important? Because with the same amount of money, people received twice as much money. And who do you think lost with that? The poverty managers. So, who was the first to complain? Bellaboni. So, the first thing Bellaboni did was organize a march, and in that march he said that 50,000 people were going to go. Because in reality he believed that 100,000 people were going to go. And there we also had to overcome an enormous test, which was that they wouldn't beat us in the street. And, with Minister Bullrich, the security protocol was prepared. From the Ministry of Human Capital it was said that whoever cuts does not get paid. In addition, a telephone was given so that people were not extorted, a complaint line was set up. The boss arrived. Hello, boss. So, in that context, it was interesting because 3,000 people ended up going to the march. The hotline exploded, and today we have a lot of cases initiated against these people, who extorted the most vulnerable. And within all these things, we found out that, in addition, they had trust funds, they had a lot of things, and where various strata of society are involved, various. And then that also explains why there is so much torpedoing. Because there are not only the poverty managers. There are businessmen involved, and there are other types of people that one would imagine to be more spiritual and not involved in this type of things. And they are all torpedoing because they have run out of work. So, that is why what happens happens, but didn't we want to end corruption? Never has so much been done in 6 months as what we are doing, and in much longer periods of time. That is to say, we are not only putting the economy in order, we are not only putting security issues in order, but we are also ending corruption, and that is why politics is on fire. But that wasn't all, because the other thing we had to do was basically clean up the central bank. There. We had to do a lot of things. The first thing we had to do was to make the exchange market honest. I remember that, at that time, they told us that we had to set the exchange rate at 600. Back then, the option of freeing up was not in the plans because with the stock problems we had, it was the path to a hyperinflation. But beyond that, we asked, how do we fix this then? The consensus of many economists was, no, set it at 600. In fact, we made this decision in the place where I was living for about 3 months at the Libertador Hotel with the Toto team. Since we were going to put in the country tax, the exchange rate was to be aligned. Our idea was that the exchange rate was aligned with that of the market. Why? Because in this way we were going to reduce the excess demand in the foreign exchange market, and by reducing the excess demand in the foreign exchange market we were going to reduce the excess supply in the goods market, in the labor market, and, therefore, the adjustment was going to be less painful. In this context, a devaluation is made, a jump in the exchange rate, and, from there, a policy of devaluations is established so that the exchange rate leads to a certain path. In this context, too, they predicted all the calamities and catastrophes that have happened and will happen, which we did not expect. None of them were met. And, what's more, many of those who said that the exchange rate had to be at 600 and made a path of inflation much higher than the observed one are in line with what they say. There is an exchange rate problem that now, obviously, is a different discussion because of all the noise that politics brought in. But then, what about all those who want to see that discussion? Can they listen to Dr. Ariazu, or can they see my presentations? And yes, but beyond that, in the meantime we bought $17.5 billion. And we continued buying dollars every day. Not only that, but we also began a process of cleaning up the central bank. We inherited a quasi-fiscal deficit of 10 points of GDP. Today it already represents 1 point of GDP. And that was achieved for 2 reasons. One is because what was sought to be arbitrated was the rate in dollars and not the rate in pesos. So, in that context, having made a devaluation leap, if we followed the flow of what many economists said, that the real interest rate had to be positive, and that argument, today, we would have a problem. That we would have liabilities remunerated by the monetary base. So, we would be talking about the carry trade, about when hyperinflation explodes and all that kind of thing. So, by setting the interest rate, arbitrated with dollars, but in terms of real pesos, negative, that is what was allowed. It was to dilute that position of remunerated liabilities. And as the fiscal adjustment was advancing, in fact, in January we already had a financial surplus, that is, not a primary surplus, but a financial surplus. And the zero deficit policy continues. And we already know that the numbers for May are looking very good. And when the first semester ends, and obviously, in June, due to the issue of the payment of bonuses and so on, there will be a deficit. But when you take the 6 months together, there will be a surplus. In other words, because everything we have added, until now, more than exceeds what we will have in deficit in June, so we will have a first semester with a positive primary result and financial result, something that they said was impossible. Impossible at all. And while we were consolidating the fiscal position, the Secretary of Finance, Pablo Curno, what did he do? He was building a peso curve, and while he was building the peso curve he began to remove debt that was in the central bank, and he began to pass it on to the treasury. So, today, the relationship between remunerated liabilities and monetary base is 1.2 times, almost a third of the problem we inherited. This is not a minor point because remunerated liabilities were future monetary emission, which meant they were a future problem in terms of inflation. And this is not a minor point because, today, we have a monetary base of 15 trillion, and that means that we have remunerated liabilities of 18 trillion. And now I am going to give you another excellent piece of news. Of those 18 trillion, 12 trillion are in the hands of the public sector, which only leaves 6 trillion left to clean up. In other words, we are there to finish with the problem of remunerated liabilities. And not only that, of those 12 trillion, which the public sector has, 7 are in the Banco Nación in the holdings of the Ministry of Economy. In the Banco Nación are 3.5 trillion. So, you are going to say, and what is left? Well, look, Banco Provincia has part of it. It's true, that is not close to our control. In fact, it is in the hands of a political enemy who, in addition, is in charge of filling the media with advertising to smear us and to cover up the blunders they make. But what is interesting? Since it has so many fiscal problems, it has the bank totally saturated, which means it doesn't have many possibilities to do things because it needs to meet the minimum cash position, which it can't do much with. Therefore, if you look, we are finishing with the problem of remunerated liabilities. Not only that, but, in addition, once we finish with this, we are going to go for the problem of the puts, which we have on track. The puts are a farce, which the previous government made, with the endorsement of the International Monetary Fund to finance the deficit in a covert way and so that it would not violate its goals. And the banks, instead of financing the treasury, preferred to put it within the central bank. And we are working to solve that problem. When we solve that problem, bye-bye, Cepo. Therefore, it is true that politics gets involved, that politics gets dirty, that politics, clearly, a large part of the politicians do not want to fix this. When you have the lay bases, plus the DNU, there is, basically, a question of returning freedom to the citizens. There is a question of making the markets more pro-competition, not pro-business, but pro-competition. And there is a third element, which is to end the scams. I believe that this third point explains this very strongly, in fact, within the things and privileges that we wanted to end with politics. Something that I am going to advance anyway. Well, I don't care at all. Yesterday, the degenerate prosecutors, one of the things they did boasting of being caste, and that they like to be caste. And that they think they are better than the rest of the people, while to approve a law that favors all Argentines, except the crooks, they have it there stopped and parked for 6 months. Yes, they are very quick to raise their salaries by 80% behind the backs of the people. While I tell you that, in the executive, the salaries are the same as when we took office. But not only that, but also, obviously, they are seeking to break the fiscal balance. Look, when Bukele took office, you know what? He didn't have any legislators, nothing. Do you know how he governed? By pure veto. All the things that the degenerate prosecutors did, he vetoed them all, which is what I am going to do. I am going to veto them all. But then, yesterday, a deputy began to defend privileged pensions. Something that, I said, we are going to give up. And also, as it is an acquired right, it is not that I am going to be touching those who are behind, but, in reality, it only affects, from me onwards. And why is this important?
Miren, yo puedo llegar a estar 4 años o puedo estar 8 años.
Look, I can stay for 4 years or I can stay for 8 years, if everything goes well, but, you know what? Afterwards, what do I do once I finish with this? I'm going to have to go out to work. So, it's interesting, because since I have to go out to work again, I have to actively take care of doing things that are good. Because if not, the day after, I'll be out of work and starving. Because, imagine what conferences I'm going to sell the day after, if I was a disaster as president. Therefore, eliminating the retirement privileges is a very important incentive to do things well. So, it's not a minor issue. But of course, after 100 years of decadence, they think that doing things badly is normal. And so, if they do anything, they have insurance. What insurance? The caste's insurance is over. If they do things badly, after doing things disastrously badly, they can starve for being shit. On the other hand, some say, no, there is no long-term program. I ask them a question, and what do you think the lay bases and the DNU were? Look, the largest structural reform in Argentine history was made by Menem. The lay basis, as it is today, is 5 times larger than Menem's structural reform. If that is not a long-term plan, what are you talking about? And, in addition, there is the DNU. When you take the DNU and the lay bases, there are 1,000 structural reforms. How many are left? 800. Okay, let's go over 800. You know what? After this, I'll go for the 200 that were pending from this. And, in addition, I have 3,000 more. And why is this? Look, when you look at the indexes of economic freedom, those countries that are freer grow more than twice as much as those that are repressed. The GDP per capita is 12 times larger. Not only that, but they also have 25 times fewer poor people in the standard format, 50 times fewer in the extreme format. What's more, the people in the worst decile of the free country live better than 90% of the people in the repressed country. They have several times more income, which is more like the same average. The business is freedom, and, for example, with Phase 1 of structural reforms, it implies a leap in economic freedom of 90 places. That is, to be like countries like Germany, France, Italy. But nothing, as you will see, these are not all the reforms we are pointing out. In fact, we have always mentioned, as a test case, what could be the case of Ireland. Of being the most miserable country in Europe, today it has a GDP per capita 50% higher than that of the United States, or countries like Switzerland, or countries like Luxembourg, whichever you want. They are among the freest. And the reality is that since we have 3,000 more structural reforms pending, once all this is over, it is not that we are going to become as free as those countries, but that we are going to be the freest country on the planet. Therefore, our objective is to become the most prosperous country on planet Earth. It seems that, for Argentine politics, it is a business to create poor people, and now we saw that what they are dedicated to is to exploit them and do business. Today I had a chat with a friend while I was having breakfast, and the subject was causality. That is, my hypothesis was that assistance is generated, for whatever reason, because they embrace wrong economic ideas and, from there, they take a noble cause, which is to give that assistance, and then they turn it into a bunch of kiosks. So, of course, when you start touching the kiosks, they accuse you of being inhuman, insensitive and all those things, when in reality what you are doing is ending the kiosks. So, one would have to ask them if they are in favor of these criminals stealing by taking bread from people's mouths. But they always move the goalposts, and obviously the guidelines play a fundamental role, which we have cut off, because if there is truly freedom, how are you going to be financing yourself with a compulsive source of income? It is a contradiction in terms. Well, it seems that, when they look at freedom and all those things, it is always so that they do not touch their pockets, also called the most sensitive organ of the human being. And my friend's hypothesis was a little more cruel, which was, in reality, they come to do business and invent all those kinds of things to do business. The truth is that politics is so dirty that I do not know which of the hypotheses can really be true. But the truth is that it is dirty, and we are sweeping that away. And I want to leave one last reflection to, at least, leave good prospects for the future. And it is what has to do with growth and convergence. Convergence is the process by which a country, which is developing, becomes a developed country. Clearly, we should be looking for a way to do that, that is, how to generate a process of sustained growth to reach one of these countries that we admire. And there are some things that I think are important to keep in mind. One is when you look at the empirical evidence of growth. You go to any book on growth or any advanced macro book and you will find some data, which are from Angus Madison, may he rest in peace, which goes from the year 0 to the year 2000 of the Christian era and is called, look at the GDP per capita, and it is called, the hockey stick. When you look at that, basically what you see is that the GDP per capita was, for 1,800 years, practically constant. In reality, it only had a jump of 40% in the 16th century. So, if you were to take the GDP per capita growth rate in that process, it was 0.02%, that is, it took approximately 3,500 years to double the GDP per capita. However, after the Industrial Revolution, the next 2 centuries were truly impressive, and a situation arose where GDP per capita was almost multiplied by 10, with an increasing acceleration. That is, in the 19th century, the GDP per capita growth rate was 0.66%, in the first part of the 20th century it was 1.2%, and in the second part it was 2.1%, and, what is more, if you correct for underestimation of national accounts, it may have been even 1 point higher growth in the second half of the 20th century. In other words, what you see is an acceleration of growth. And if you also consider the population, given the population that there was around the year 1800, and the one that there was at the end of the 20th century. To maintain the analysis of that series, more or less the population multiplied by 8 or by 7, if you want, by 8, but. So when you look at that, that has a flip side in economics that is called increasing returns. And there is a whole issue there because increasing returns, the flip side of that is, if you want it technically it is called convexities, if you want it in more friendly language it is called concentrated structures. The most polar case is that of monopolies. And this is not a minor issue, because according to conventional economic theory, monopolies are bad and they must be regulated. And that is quite conflictive because how can it be that for the micro that is bad and, in the middle, the extreme population of 95% of the population lived less with $1 a day and that number? When in the series that we are looking at, had dropped to less than 15%. So how can it be that something that was so good for humanity is treated as something bad by microeconomics? That has several problems. Microeconomics has problems, not the series. What happens is that the reasonable thing is that if the model does not map with reality, you break the model and make another one. Economists, I don't know, we got something strange in our heads, since I don't have the data, I don't know. But we have this madness that when reality does not map with the model, we call it market failure. For those who make serious decisions, they know that this is a serious problem. So, in reality, that analysis is wrong, basically because the only monopoly that is bad is the monopoly that is determined by the force of the state. In fact, the original definition of monopoly is from Lord Coke, which is the one taken by Adam Smith, and which indicates that a monopoly is basically a situation in which the monarch, the feudal lord, the prince, whoever you can think of, determined what could or could not be bought of a certain product. So, I was giving someone a monopoly. Obviously, that was against the people and in favor of the businessmen and the monarch. But if there is no violent event, it is not a problem. In fact, let's suppose that I have a situation where I have 10 companies selling cell phones. And one appears and sells me a cell phone at a lower price and of better quality. Obviously, the remaining 9 are going to go bankrupt. And what do I care? If I now have a better quality product at a better price. Not only that, in fact, many people worry about that. There is a very basic book on economics that is very nice, called Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt, which says what the difference is between a good economist and a bad economist. It is that a bad economist only looks at one sector and does not look at the consequences in other sectors, and even less at the consequences in the future. That is to say, a good economist not only looks at that sector, but also looks at the other sectors and not only considers the present, but also considers the implications for the future. That is, it is the difference between doing partial equilibrium, of a single period, versus doing general equilibrium, intertemporal. So, when you start to remove those spider webs that are in people's heads, things change substantially. Therefore, the first thing to understand is that monopolies are not bad. In fact, I would tell you that monopolies can be wonderful if they are a consequence of there being one. And if you don't like that there is only one, don't get angry with the one that is there. Get angry with those that are not there, not with the one that is there. Because the one that is there is fixing people's problems. unless it is fixed by the government, which is another problem. But the problem there is not that there is only one businessman, but the problem is that there is the state. And why is that important? Because the flip side of increasing returns is what generates economic growth. And when governments start regulating monopolies, one of the things they do is kill quasi-rent. When they kill quasi-rent, they kill the incentive to innovate, and when they kill the incentive to innovate, they kill economic growth and convergence, which in the growth literature is a mathematical problem, I would say, has to do with the shape of the production function. And there is no other explanation than that problem. So there is no explanation of why it converges, no. You have the model and then it has to do with the curvatures of the curve, and that is how it is going to be. It is all mathematical fireworks. I am being quite elegant today. At another time I would say other things, but I will try to maintain the forms, not because of the investiture, but because I have a giant here. So, I will try to behave better. So, I say, but that is mathematical fireworks. It is interesting, for example, Musk seeing it as a Hayekian issue or combined with Israel Kirzner, where Hayek sees the market as a discovery process, and that Israel Kirzner sees the market as a process that mixes the discovery process, but with Locke's principle of appropriation. Because the truth is that, if you are going to discover something, but you cannot appropriate it, why do you want to discover it? So, that combination makes that discovery process generate economic growth. I mean, why? Because you start solving problems. What's more, look, there is one thing, when we had the first meeting with Elon Musk and my sister read it to him right away. Elon Musk, do you know why he is wonderful and why he is doing well and deserves to do well? He told me, I get up every day thinking about what problem I can solve for people. It is a genius because basically if he solves people's problems he will get his products to sell. Consequently, if he does it well, he makes a lot of money. Bravo, that is, a hero, a social benefactor, that is. I think that politics will have to spend 50 years explaining the mind of that man, and today I am inaudible, I am optimistic. Or it would be easier for them to understand it if they were given a ticket, but since we are not willing to play in that league, it does not happen. But apart from that, what is interesting about all this? It is that when one is in a developing country, there are a lot of opportunities that have already been discovered in other places. Therefore, what one would have to do is, what is it? Copy it, and if one copies, one will grow very strongly. And with the advance of information, that copying is faster. So, for example, look, the first country to double the GDP per capita was the United Kingdom, in a process that lasted 58 years, starting in 1780. And that meant that the GDP per capita grew by 1.2%. The second to achieve this, starting in 1839, which took 47 years, was the United States. This implied a growth rate of 1.5% per capita. The third to achieve this was Japan, in 34 years, starting in 1885, and that implied a per capita growth rate of 2.1%. Another case is that of Italy, which did it in 21 years, starting in 1890, and that implied a growth rate of 3.3%. Spain, in 1950, did it in 18 years with a rate of 4%. South Korea, since 1978, took 9 years, a rate of 7.8%. Or China, which started in 1987, and did it in 7 years, with growth rates of 10%. That is, notice that as we move forward in time, the convergence processes occur faster because the discovery process is valid at the frontier. But in the transition, what we have to do is have good institutions so that we copy and grow, and that is by gaining economic freedom. And why I am particularly interested in the case of artificial intelligence, because artificial intelligence is like the new industrial revolution. And what was the industrial revolution in history? That's why I talked about the hockey stick. It implied a dramatic increase in the growth rate. So, what does artificial intelligence generate? It generates an exacerbation of increasing returns. That exacerbation of increasing returns implies acceleration in the growth rate. And the way to achieve that acceleration of growth is not to kill it with economic regulation. What is the area that grows the least on the planet, despite having a pole of artificial intelligence? Europe, because it is full of regulations. When you start to think like macroeconomists and want to make the monopoly look like a competitive company, you are destroying the quasi-rents. You are destroying the extraordinary benefits, you are destroying the incentives for innovation, you are killing economic growth. What is the problem in the other pole, which is the United States? Well, because it is also running and they are afraid of the issues of artificial intelligence. That is to say, every so often, the Luddites always reappear, that is, those who hate the machine and, in reality, the other pole, what is it? China, but we don't know what it does. So, we are offering Argentina to be this fourth pole of artificial intelligence in the world. And why? Because we have large areas of land, cold climate where all this is very important. Possibility of having a lot of cheap energy, it is very important, for what? So that intelligent algorithms can learn. And that generates a lot of heat, so that is why it is so important to have a cold, extensive area of land and cheap energy. But, in addition, we also have what? Human capital. And if we, then, generate the correct institutions, be it the DNU, be it bases, that is to say, phase 1 of the structural reforms, or everything that remains pending to make us the freest country on planet Earth, it will imply that we will have the conditions so that, in a period of at most 40 years, we will once again be the first world power. Thank you very much.